Crazy Bernie.
In case you haven't noticed, Donald Trump is now paying attention to our campaign. In fact, in the last few days, he and his Republican apparatchiks have been attacking us over and over and over again. In other words, the most dangerous president in modern American history is getting a little nervous. And you know what? He should be getting very nervous. Because after we win the Democratic nomination, we are going to beat him, and we're going to beat him badly. And let me tell you how we're going to do that. By telling the truth. And the truth is that Trump is not just a pathological liar, and it's not just that he's running the most corrupt administration in the modern history of our country, or that he is a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, a xenophobe, and a religious bigot. That's true, but that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that he is a total 100% fraud. In 2016, Trump told the working people of this country that he was going to stand with them against the establishment. Remember that? He was going to take on the establishment. What a joke. Trump told everybody that he was going to provide health care for everyone. And then, as president, shock of all shocks, he attempted to throw 32 million Americans off the health care that they have. During his campaign, Trump told the American people that his tax plan would protect the working class of this country and not the wealthy. But the legislation he pushed as president over a 10-year period gives 83% of the benefits to the top 1%. And in fact will raise taxes for millions of middle-class families. During his campaign, Trump told the American people that he was a different type of Republican. Remember that? He was not McConnell. He was not your average Republican. And he, as president, would not cut Medicaid. He wouldn't cut Medicare. He wouldn't cut Social Security. And yet, the last two budgets that he produced called for massive cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, and billions in cuts to the Social Security Disability Fund. In other words, once again, told the American people one thing as a candidate, did something very different as president.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA. Special Friday show where we say, win the damn Iowa caucuses with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, Briahna Joy Gray. She joins us, National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign. First and foremost, TMBS show crew. We're talking about who is really electable. Let's get honest here about who fares the best against Donald Trump in the failing, imploding, historically unpopular Democratic Party. What's a path out for justice and dignity for all and defeating the grotesque authoritarianism of Donald Trump and the Republican Party? Republican senators, they don't want to see witnesses, see and hear nothing. It's a foregone conclusion. And if there's anything to learn from this impeachment process, it's that any fiction of the Republican Party being anything other than fundamental gravediggers and enemies of democracy. And forget two-tier justice system. We have a quadruple-tier justice system in this country with complete criminal impunity for some. Petra Costa is joining us as well. She is the director of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Edge of Democracy. She's joining us in studio. This is the story of Brazil, the coup against Dilma, the political imprisonment of Lula da Silva. Watch the second part of our interview we did with him with Brazil Wire that went up yesterday. We're talking about her documentary, The Story of Brazil, and how it relates to the broader global democratic struggle and against all of the monsters dominating global politics, from the United States to Hungary. We've got a shout out, of course. Why is it that the military members are doing great in terms of contributing to Bernie Sanders? Why do they not like Joe Biden so much? Why? David Griscom has a shout out in the post game. A incredible, delusional, unhinged performance from a Clintonoid. We'll break it down, a debunk on some fear-mongering from Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times, an analysis of the formalization of apartheid that Donald Trump and Jared Kushner are putting forward in the Middle East, and a whole lot more. Excited to be here. We will be back next Wednesday. On Monday night, I'm co-anchoring coverage of the Iowa Caucuses on Rising with Crystal and Sagar. And of course, we've got a great think tank for you on Sunday and a bunch of other stuff to talk about. But first, let's talk about how you actually deal with propaganda. How do you actually deal with the fact that truth in our world is both multifaceted and also, where it is objective, is under relentless attack? In the Trump era, liberals have become obsessed with a notion of facts. Actually, this goes back earlier. Jon Stewart and others thought that George W. Bush's warmongering and violations of the Constitution could be counteracted with simply stating the truth as it was. And this is really contradictory because, one, truth is always, and fact, not truth, but facts are always second order things. They only really make a difference if they're contextualized in a broader narrative and a broader argument. Standalone facts mean very little without them being part of a broader narrative and story to understand power, as an example, first and foremost. The other extraordinary thing is that America, for generations, going back to Eddie Bernays, if we could start with him, has been subject to relentless campaigns of propaganda, or as politely called, public relations, across every sector of our lives, from military propaganda in Hollywood films to sugary drinks sold to children that cause obesity to the selling of presidencies. Joe Lockhart, who is a pundit on CNN, who has been claiming for quite some time now that Bernie Sanders has never been vetted. He hosts a podcast called Words Matter, and I'm inclined to agree with that sentiment. And I'm also inclined to question why somebody who has such noble views of words, who after serving as Bill Clinton's press secretary, went on to co-found a firm called the Glover Park Group, which runs PR and AstroTurf campaigns for clients including Verizon, the Saudi royal government, as well as Pete Peterson's fear-mongering efforts to cut Social Security and Medicare. The context at which Donald Trump was able to lie and lie and lie was facilitated first and foremost by media that covered his whole spectacle as the rating bonanza it was, without any concern for our democracy and well-being, as well as the victims of his racist and xenophobic rallies, but also into a context where Americans had already been spun and manipulated in every way imaginable. And of course, spin and propaganda is a global industry. This is another way of actually having a smart conversation about Russia. It's not to deny that Russia doesn't have a foreign policy interest in influencing other people's elections. We certainly do in the United States. China increasingly does, particularly in the continent of Africa. And political consultants of all backgrounds trade their wares across the globe. And if you don't think that those consultants have some overlap with the dominant and prevailing foreign policy interests of the home countries they represent, particularly in the center of empire like the United States, you're being delusional. It doesn't mean there's coordination. It doesn't mean anything like that, although it could, but it does mean that these are synchronized interests. There's a reason why, as an example, American consultants were in Venezuela furiously trying to dislodge Hugo Chavez, even as other parts of the covert American state were planning coups against him. So, of course, Russia has propaganda campaigns. And of course, there's PR that emanates from the Kremlin. And in fact, a lot of those techniques are a fusion of homegrown, fascinating developments in communication that arose in a Russian context that related to Russian art movements and literature and filtered into politics. That's what Peter Pomerantsev writes about. But he writes about it in isolation. He doesn't look at, or he spends a little bit of time, but not with the central fact that in the 1990s, when the World Bank and IMF and Wall Street were devastating Russia, decreasing life expectancy, and partnering with oligarchs to rob the country blind, American consultants and PR technicians were in the country breeding these skill sets. In 1996, Boris Yeltsin's re-election campaign was engineered by American consultants. So propaganda is a global thing. It is a systemic thing. And these are not mostly campaigns simply of, quote, lying about or misinformation in the sense of lying about facts. These are narrative shapers. These are fake grassroots efforts, as an example. A firm called Dewey Square Group has been accused of pioneering that technique, as an example. So now we come to 2020 and the giant fake news freak out of our time, which has missed the broader structural problem of PR and propaganda as a global symptom of late-stage capitalism that distorts public discourse, campaigns, and public information across the board, has dumbed that conversation down to a question of, quote, facts, and not people actually having a serious material understanding of their lives. It has rightly critiqued the pernicious anti-democratic dangers of Silicon Valley, but in a way that is so dumbed down as to mostly simply empower, as an example, neoconservative think tanks in Washington to tell Facebook what is and isn't news, thereby, by the way, delegitimizing vital left-wing voices and voices from the periphery. Elizabeth Warren, whose campaign, I'm sorry, cannot be described as anything other than a thoroughgoing embarrassment, has released a plan which, let's be clear, maybe CNBC and their framing of it was sort of exaggerating what she was putting forward. But let's be very clear. As soon as you open the door to lodging criminal prosecution of people for quote-unquote misinformation online, this is a Pandora's box. Now, specifically, Elizabeth Warren is talking about penalizing people who release lies and fake information about voting. As an example, don't forget to vote on Thursday, or don't forget to vote on Wednesday, as an example. Or sure, you can both vote for Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren, New York Times readers. That is what she's talking about. Now, those things should be illegal regardless, and they should be covered under voting rights legislation to restore, as an example, the Voting Rights Act as part of a beefed up effort to fight the decades-long Republican campaign to disenfranchise people of color and block them from the ballot across this country. But what she's not doing that. She is connecting this to a broader fight against dishonesty and disinformation online, and literally opening the door for a federal government to penalize people on independent platforms for this misinformation. Now, if we've already seen how this is played out, just even in terms of voluntary initiatives, Facebook handing over foreign policy to the right-wing Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., should see the analytics that I see from, as an example, Brazil Wire on our interview with President Lula. This is a internationally significant interview. It gets no likes, to paraphrase Maria Bartiromo, in the algorithm. She also puts pressure on major social media companies to combat fake news by labeling if sources are funded by the government and push for more fact-checking accounts that spread false information and creating clear consequences for accounts that attempt to interfere with voting. And this links us, yes, go ahead real quick.
It's weird, the fixation on government public spending and not like as if private capitalism completely destroying our information system.
This is exactly right. You could precisely. The Koch brothers have done more to damage this country's democracy than Russia could ever even pray to do. So we have a structural problem here of misdiagnosing the problem, opening the door to government overreach, and what really just, when you send out smoke signals like this, why wouldn't Silicon Valley just say, we don't want to deal with this? Let's just shut down all political programming on YouTube. Let's just shut down anything that isn't NBC News. And as they've proven before, they make no distinction between adversarial investigative reporting and Alex Jones. And I think increasingly liberals don't either, frankly. Then we get to the fallacy and the obsession and the delusion of fact-checking. Since Trump won, liberals have been clamoring for more fact-checking and for organizations to quote-unquote fight fake news. Well, the results have been horrendous. From the Washington Post publishing borderline slanderous accusations against numerous journalists and accounts, all based off of a report originating from a group called Prop or Not with no vetting. Twitter pulling and banning left-wing accounts haphazardly. Facebook fact checkers, including publications like the right-wing Daily Caller. And this isn't fake, and this isn't to say fake news or propaganda more fully understood isn't a problem. But it can't be an excuse to silence the left and bring legitimacy to corporate media. The whole obsession with fact-checking is bogus. You can't fact-check the problems of democracy away. The professional managerial idea that we can do away with questions of power, legitimacy, and community with politics, we need to deal with that. And this insistence that fact-checkers with all their biases and motivations are going to be able to properly convey what is true and false is a fantasy and opens up the door for right-wing and neoliberal limits on free speech. I don't want Glenn Kessler presiding over a global system of true or not, frankly. In Brazil, I spent time in a favela and was amazed and inspired by a community radio station that I was honored to tour and talk on a little bit. This effort started with people putting sound speakers on windows across the community so they could beam out messages on employment, on health, when houses needed to be protected from a police raid. Gradually, it turned into a unofficial pirate radio, and then under the Lula administration, these types of radio stations were given recognition and licenses. That is the type of grassroots dynamism and actual bottom-up empowerment that is threatened by totalitarian technocracy. Of course there's propaganda. Of course there's dishonesty, primarily originating from the corporate sector. And how you do that is get rid of money in politics, have an adversarial relationship to propaganda itself, create teaching curriculums in schools for kids to actually understand how propaganda works, not just to find errant facts. There's a section of the population that believes that they have facts on their side and therefore everyone else should get out of their way and let them make decisions. This decision is wrong because it's anti-democratic, but because these people are just often dead wrong about the world they live in. In the past few years, if we've been taught anything, it's that these elite institutions and pedigrees are clueless about how to create political movements that can beat the right, fight inequality and climate crisis. We shouldn't empower them to govern our media either. Folks, we're going to take a little bit of a different track here because we're running a little bit behind. We're going to do a quick pitch, and then we're going to get Bree on the phone, and then we'll come back with the shout out and the gem before Petra comes on. But I want to just say it's very important you become a patron. Here's the bigger goal basically for a number of things that we're talking about, including TMBS guides that we're starting to work on, which are like basically commentaries that you've watched but fit into books and built around different themes and built out a bit. That's one project. People who've ordered gear, they were mailed today. You would have gotten your information, and you can go to the website and keep ordering those. They're incredibly important for us. And we are also selling them at our live shows, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So basically, I would say the goal is that by the election, we're at a minimum at 5,000 patrons. Better yet, at 6,000 or 7,000 patrons. And then, we've got, look, in terms of the documentary films and other actual original pieces that we want to do, like the Lula interview, things in that vein, building that out. And then also, potentially some other things that we'll talk about more later that will require some real investment and time. So it's really important. The growth has been amazing. We appreciate all of you so much. We took a little, I'm not going to lie. It's not really a thing, but the last couple of days have been bad. We had a little bit of a dip, but we're very well on track in terms of the actual trends. And so the next immediate goal that we want to hit ambitiously over the month of February, but certainly by the end of March, is to get to 4,000 patrons. Cannot emphasize to you enough how good the content is. We're incredibly proud of it. You really get a whole different show universe when you're a patron. Histories, think tanks, idea primers, documentary films at the 21 and above, sometimes group calls. Those documentary films are then released after being behind a paywall for about a month. We just released The Illicit History of the Rand Corporation. You should watch it. So very important that you become a patron. That's how this all happens. That's how we grow it. And that's how we counteract all of the things we're talking about. Patreon.com/TMBS. Extraordinarily proud of the interviews with President Lula. Please watch. Extraordinarily proud of the panel with Dr. West, which we will be premiering on TMBS tomorrow. If you're watching this and you can, hit us with a super chat. That helps YouTube. Everything is really growing with YouTube, and it's very important for marketing and people understanding the show. So if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and hit the bell button. But YouTube is definitely totally favoring corporate media. They put things on hold and review all the time. And so, that makes us, harder, frankly, and a little bit more of a time suck. So if you can, hit us with a super chat, that's great. That certainly helps, but become a patron, tmbs.fm, to get everything, including over the next several weeks, you're going to be hearing a lot about Against the Web, the Cosmopolitan Socialist Answer to the New Right, my book that's coming out shortly from Zero Books, information on how you can pre-order it and everything else. Come see us in Brooklyn, February 7th at the Bell House. You can snag, I honestly don't know. I know there's a few tickets left now. It will either be open through the show or will sell out in a couple of days. Grab them. And then I'm incredibly excited. We're hitting the Lone Star State. The North Door in Austin, Texas, with Anna Kasparian and Abby Martin. That's going to be a monster show. So we're excited to see you guys. Patreon.com/TMBS. And we'll be back in a minute with Briahna Joy Gray. Joining us now is Briahna Joy Gray. She is the National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders for President. She's also an alumni of TMBS University. Bree, how you doing?
Is my certificate in the mail? Is this a for-profit institution?
Yes, all of the above. Emphasis on in the mail.
We have a plan for universities like yours.
Oh, wait a second. All right, guys. Hot, surprising announcement. Donald Trump has been steering this country in the right direction. Bree, first of all, thank you guys. I think you guys are, doing very well, and everybody should stay relentless and act like you're 20 points behind and all the rest. But clearly some things are breaking through, and things are breaking through to the point where, of course, there's a big neurotic freakout across a lot of legacy media and in sort of elite Democratic circles. And so let's just get down to it. I mean, why, in your view, and I'll say this transparently, I think you could have made a case a while ago for various reasons that I always thought it was Bernie or Biden were the most electable, frankly, as like an outside arbiter. Increasingly, it seems to me, Bernie is like the only one to responsibly put up against Donald Trump. But regardless of that, why is all of these stories that we're seeing from the Chates and Frums of the world, why is that not conforming with reality?
Why is it that people who have always been cheerleaders for war and the corporatist candidate don't like Bernie Sanders?
Yes, Bri. I like how you took my loaded question and just like loaded it a couple more notches. Go for it.
Look, I mean, we knew this was coming, right? When Bernie Sanders started talking about how we welcome their hatred during his Democratic Socialist speech back in the summer, he was presaging what was going to come down the pike when it became finally clear to the establishment that we didn't just have a chance of winning, we had a very strong chance of winning, and that they were going to have to start to show their cards and more explicitly combat us if they didn't want us to radically change the country the way that millions of Americans who have donated to our campaign in smaller donations, volunteered on our behalf, and otherwise put their lives behind this effort, know they want to have done, right? They know that the only way to push back against the overwhelming will of the people that has been demonstrated in myriad ways through this campaign is to rig the system. And that's what we're seeing now. We saw it first in this media push. We're seeing it a little bit with what's happening with these DNC rules. And it's what is expected when you have a movement that is presents such a sea change, which with business as usual.
And with regard, and let's get to the rules in a second, but I think it's really important what you're saying. I think what these talking points and this spin is meant to do is, of course, there's a contingent of people that are elite and they hate Sanders and they hate the movement and they're militarists and all the rest for sure. And they can have their own sort of self-perpetuating narrative. I think the idea, though, is that to the extent it filters out into the actual population is just to have people feel like they know that they're wronged. They know that things are bad. But you know what? Don't hope to change. Don't actually feel comfortable to take what you perceive as a risk. And so how on an emotional level, I'm actually basically asking, do we counteract that, even beyond, debunking all the kind of obvious spin here?
When I talk to folks, and this happened in an interview I did earlier today, some of the skepticism that I think exists around Bernie Sanders from people who want to support his policies, who personally support his policies and agree with what he's identified as the things that need to change in the world. The skepticism comes from this. It's thinking that, well, if the polls show that we all agree that we want things like, free public college and Medicare for all and canceling student debt, if polls show that even majorities of Republicans want all those things, why is it that we haven't had them? It must be too good to be true. It must be that the polls are wrong, because politicians would never do something that the voters that elect them didn't want, right? That's kind of, I think, in my observation, the root of some of that skepticism, the good faith skepticism. And the piece of the puzzle that's missing is the piece that identifies why it is that politicians aren't beholden to the will of majorities of people, why our democracy has been undermined. And that's because, as you well know, Michael, the role the money has been playing in politics increasingly since the 1970s, to be frank. I mean, if those of you who listen to Hear the Burn, the podcast that I host for the campaign, know that this week's episode opened with a gloss on the Powell memo, which is this 1971 memo that was a blueprint for how Republicans were going to take back the country after decade of progress, labor progress, racial progress, gender progress, LGBT progress, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is it's worked. The apotheosis of all of this in a lot of ways was Citizens United. And now we have a system where overwhelmingly politicians are more beholden to the big corporate interests that are funding their campaigns than anyone else. And Bloomberg's presence in this race, the way that he is buying a position in this without ever having to defend his views on a debate stage, now muscling himself onto a debate stage, getting the DNC to change these rules by using his ad power to rank higher than many other front runners in this race in key delegate-rich states, it's an abomination. And I don't think that, I think it's incumbent on us to make it clear to Americans why this is anti-democratic, why it's something that regardless of their political affiliations, they should not countenance. And we've got to push back forcefully.
Bri, I want to get really specifically, because you did open it, about getting really serious about the real time, what the DNC is doing in real time with regards to Bloomberg, with regards to putting somebody like, I keep focusing on Barney Frank on the Rules Committee. This is somebody who's not only sits on a bank board and represents the Clinton wing, let's just say. He personally hates Bernie Sanders. Like, you're talking about people who not only are ideologically and in terms of, potentially even financial self-interest opposed, they have a personal fixation and dislike of him. So it's very important to have a strategy for that. But I do just want to say really quickly, and forgive my indulgence here, Bri. Earlier, you were questioning the value of your degree, and you've just said that you're hosting a successful podcast. So I think that speaks for itself.
You're presuming that I learned all of my podcasting skills
Yes.
at the Michael Brooks Show
Yes.
Academy of Fine Arts.
You are basically like Gallery Delabate talking about the Connecticut School of Broadcasting. But all that being said, what do you think? What is the... Because I want people to think really seriously about this. There was a lot of and look, we don't know obviously what all the scenarios are, but people need to think, in my view, in terms of like really winning this and being very aggressive out of the gate, because the barriers are being put in place and the games are being played right now, and it's quite transparent.
Yeah. Well, I think the transparency works on our behalf, right? There has been a process. I mean, there's always a process of kind of education. When we live in a society that has done so much to kind of obscure the political reality of what's going on in our system, the last 3 years since 2016 have really made it so that some of the conversations about the inequities in our political system are a lot more obvious now than they were then. And we're at a different kind of a starting point when we're talking to the public about what's going on. And what was kind of had some plausible deniability around it in 2016 is much less so now. And now we have like these exaggerated caricatures, right? So you can say what you want to say about the critiques of Hillary Clinton and her closeness to Wall Street, speeches, what have you, no interest in getting back into all of that. But when you look at a figure like Michael Bloomberg, who has $50-60 billion, and the ability to hop into a race and spend more money on ads than every other candidate in the race so far, even though we've all been campaigning for a year and he just hopped in a couple of months ago, those kind of imbalances, the way that someone's not just, through lobbying dollars influencing politics, but through your own personal pocketbook can have such a dominant role is something that I don't think very many people are going to take sitting down. And if people want to rig this race, the way, we've talked about media bias and things like that, but if people are going to want to so aggressively and explicitly rig this race, they're going to have to contend with the fact that Americans aren't going to take it. I don't think they're going to take it sitting down. And I think that you see that with this kind of anxiety about what's going to happen to Bernie voters. There's a lot of hand-wringing about, well, are Bernie voters going to line up behind the eventual nominee? Well, we saw in 2016 that Bernie voters lined up behind the eventual nominee twice as much as Hillary Clinton voters lined up behind Barack Obama in 2008. But what is a real thing to think about is the fact that this campaign is premised on turning out people who historically don't vote, turning out people who historically have no interest in the democratic process because they don't see themselves represented there. And you cannot reasonably expect people like that to necessarily feel similarly engaged for any candidate interchangeably. So we have this support. We have support from people who don't normally get involved. And that is part of Bernie's electability argument. And just because Bernie is going to fight hard as heck for anyone who wins this nomination, because the number one priority is beating Donald Trump, doesn't mean that people are going to necessarily, the constituents that have come out, who would only come out for Bernie, are going to heed that lesson. And that's not something that is a, threat, but it's a realistic decision to make when you're thinking about who's the most electable candidate and who really is the best position to beat Trump.
That's a really important point. And I also think it's also important. Look, again, I'll keep reiterating this. The goal should absolutely win by such a margin that even these games are out of question. And that really, and I love the energy and people's forcefulness with this, because that's really what it's going to take. But the question needs to start to shift, I think. I mean, first of all, Bernie should never get the question, will you support the nominee one way or another? Because he's been very clear about that. But
right,
even beyond that, other people have maybe been not clear about that. But the second question to start asking is, do you believe that the person who has the delegate lead should be the nominee? Do you believe the person who has received the most votes and has the delegate lead should be the nominee? We need to be quite clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I hope that other journalists who have not graduated from your esteemed institution take that very sage advice and start asking that question.
And also I want to say, I mean, look, Mike Bloomberg is walking around saying he's never taking money from special interests. When you have $50 billion, you are a special interest.
You're the special interest.
You are literally a special interest.
Yeah. And, you've seen what's come out today about the enormous amount of money he gave to the DNC right before he started his run. Mm-hmm. The idea, there are people in politics who will look at you in the eye and say, having been given $350,000 doesn't influence me in any way. Right. I don't think that anyone who's ever earned a paycheck, who's ever lived their life as a human being in this country, is going to swallow that, to borrow a phrase from our friend Joe Biden, malarkey, with ease. Right. So I think we're going to see, if people were worried that this primary is divisive, that there is a lack of unity, I don't think this kind of a move is going to start to remedy that concern. And you're going to see people the same way there have been all these bad faith attacks over the last month or so. All of them have kind of inured to the benefit of Bernie Sanders. Our polls have been going up. The fundraising has been coming in. Americans are seeing clearly what's going on. And at this point, I want to keep pushing the message, revealing, being really clear-eyed and honest about what's happening here. Because I think when presented with the truth, the people power that we've mustered in the course of this campaign really does have the power and authority to push back in a way that hasn't always been true.
I think that's true. Final question really quick before you go. You're somebody who's always, from the beginning of doing work with you, been a great advocate of, I would say, grounded optimism. So you're also, in addition to dealing with all of this garbage that we're talking about, you're also in the field, you're talking to people. You are getting a sense of, I think, what is really some legitimately incredible momentum and people's recognition that their fates aren't sealed, that things can actually be quite different in a positive way. And if there's anything from that you can mirror to the audience and reflect out in these last several days before Iowa and make them feel of that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm genuinely humbled to be in the position that I'm in on this campaign, where I get to be exposed firsthand. It's my whole job to listen to and take in and ruminate on all of the stories that you hear powerfully told to Bernie Sanders and other surrogates at rallies, at town halls, on the campaign trail, to read all the Bernie stories that have been trickling in, and to understand in a way that I don't know is true of other campaigns, how much people who support Bernie because they feel like it's an existential issue. Right. And not just because the climate is an existential issue for all of us, but because when you're talking about healthcare as a human right, whether or not in the richest country in the history of the world, whether you live or die should be dependent on how much money you were born with or how good the insurance your employer provides is. When you're talking about, 30 to 40,000 people dying a year simply because of a lack of access to health care, or the fact that the average student in America graduates with $30,000 of debt that follows them for the rest of their lives. When you're talking about the mass incarceration crisis, where we have more people locked up in this country than anywhere else in the world, and you have 12 people dying in Parchman Prison in Mississippi over the course of the last month or so, when you're talking about a crisis of the proportions that we're talking about now that affects so many millions of Americans, there is an energy that is both humbling and incredibly galvanizing. And I know that energy is going to carry us through in Iowa. You see it in our volunteer effort on the ground. And I believe truly to the tip of my toes, as some of our friends in this race like to say, that this movement is something that is a lot bigger than this campaign. And so I think that we need to continue to fight like we are 10 points behind.
Definitely.
Don't stop calling, texting, sign up for a shift if you haven't done so already. It's a lot easier than you think it is, I promise you. If you think you're going to be bad on the phone or, not do a good job and think, oh, it's better off for me to sit on the sidelines, that's not true. Please, please, please download the Burn app, BERN, and put in your friends and family, message them, make sure they're registered and they know where to do and and where to go, because that kind of relational organizing is the number one way you convince people, talking about your story to people that trust you and know you and love you. And please have faith and confidence that we can do this. We truly can change the settled expectations of this country so that our democratic system actually delivers for the people, the demos rather than the corporations. And thank you so much for all of the support you've given already.
Briahna, thank you so much. It's so awesome, this journey, which I still think is just beginning, but it's very cool that 2 years ago we were sitting here talking about important things to talk about, and now here we are with this emergence. And I also just want to say that we're incredibly proud that you've graduated from this institution, and this is the type of skill set you just heard that we cultivate here.
Well, thank you, Professor Brooke.
Of course. All right. Thank you. Briahna Joy Gray, National Press Secretary, Bernie Sanders for president. Let's do this. Come on. Let's be real. Briahna, thank you so much. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. Here's what we're going to do. We have a couple of quick segments to get to, and then Petra is going to join us. But let's start with the shout-out.
Shout out, shout out, shout out.
This is Nervous Curtains.
Still in recovery mode.
I love it.
Shout out, shout out, shout out.
So
My brain is still in recovery
I think
mode.
this
Shout
is
out,
really
shout out.
interesting,
Taking so
actually.
many high-level important ideas.
Ideas.
Shout out, shout out. From taking in so many high-level important ideas. The dial of ideas. I like talking about ideas. High level. The exchange of ideas. Shout out, shout out. High level. Still in recovery mode. Looking forward to sharing more ideas.
Has he launched yet?
What do you
Is
mean?
he on because he was joining the Glenn Beck thing?
I think so.
Which I called a while ago, by the way. There's one candidate who has taken some stands and has some real clarity about cutting defense spending, cutting military spending, dealing with the military-industrial complex, and all of the myriad consequences that U.S. empire has internationally and domestically. That's Bernie Sanders. And as a result of that, he has raised more money from than any other candidate, including Donald Trump, from active duty troops. That's right. So shout out to the troops, many of whom are clearly recognizing that they have a candidate who is actually concerned about their well-being, who isn't going to deploy them in foreign fantasy wars to compensate for their own imploded masculinity. I do have David Frum on the mind this week. And these numbers are pretty stunning. Can you read them off, Matt?
Yeah, Bernie Sanders has pulled in 185K, Donald Trump 113K, Buttigieg 80,000, Warren 64,000, and Joe Biden at about half of Warren's total with $33,000.
Why?
Which is like probably just two guys. Or I mean, well, I guess there's caps, but probably like 8 guys maybe.
I think these numbers also reflect, again, the real dynamics of what could actually happen in this election in terms of who you also want to bring up against Donald Trump, in terms of developing like an actual real organic constituency that has some actual relationship with real issues as they're lived in real life. So props to the troops that are donating to Sanders. Shout out, shout out, shout out. It's time for the gem with David Griscom.
Let's do it.
Wait, actually, really quick, do you guys want anything to drink? I'll say this on air. This is do you want anything like one of these?
Yeah, we have good waters.
We have. Okay.
All right.
If David's ready to go, Matt will get water.
Yeah.
All right,
Let's
awesome.
do this. Yeah, I want. We have the spin dress, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about this. I tweeted something out recently that story in Yahoo News about how the financial media is already starting to get a little worried about the Bernie Sanders candidacy. They don't think that he's going to win the nomination, but they're saying, if he does, be prepared for a sell-off. Now, of course, these kind of things, for the most part, are hot air and threats, but there is one thing that we do know, which is that the capitalist class, and specifically the financial class, is not going to be very happy with the Bernie Sanders presidency, and they're going to try to punish him. In the same way that they punish governments across the world whenever a left-wing candidate comes into power, the first thing that they do is there's massive sell-offs, and then there's what's called a capital strike or capital flight. Capital strike is when they're refusing investment, they're trying to move their money out of the country to avoid taxes, and capital flight is exactly what it sounds like, moving money outside of the country. So this is something that we really need to be talking about in the United States, in the UK, anywhere we're trying to move into more democratic socialist politics, which is reintroducing a regime, international regime of capital controls to prevent the capitalist class from being able to subvert democracy by pulling out all of the money out of a country. And I know this might sound like a little radical to some folks, but this was actually like the global financial order for a very long time and was the norm under Bretton Woods, which some people call the golden age of capitalism.
Right.
So the movement to destroy capital controls, and there's a lot of different things that capital controls can be, but fundamentally what the idea is that you're making it difficult for people to just up and root and move all their money out of a country. So you can do that through taxes, you can do that through banning banks from making certain kind of international transactions. There's a lot of tools that you can use for this. But there was a huge shift under the neoliberal, Reformation under Reagan and Thatcher, the end of the Bretton Woods system, to say that it's better for the global economy for there to be free movement of capital with no restrictions.
Right.
Well, the reality obviously is very different from the theory, and one, it's been devastating for most developing countries because they have people just moving money out of their country. It's very easy for financial organizations to extract large amounts of value and then bring them into the United States. It's very easy for rich people in the United States to move all of their money outside of the U.S. into tax havens. And this idea that trade would equalize across the globe if you had free movement of capital has not been shown in any of the data. So it's very important that we start talking about being prepared to implement capital controls, because they are going to try to punish a Bernie Sanders administration, just like they would try to punish a labor organization, administration, or even what we've been seeing in Mexico with AMLO's government. And I just think there's two very important things that I want people to understand. Is one, that the question of capital controls is class warfare. It's just like many other aspects of the class warfare. It's one that one side is winning dramatically. So the fact that rich people can move their money, can buy large amounts of property all around the world with no check on that power, is because the capitalists were able to lobby, international institutions to make this move. And also was the merging of industrial capital with financial capital, because industrial capital usually would like to stay, rooted in one place. But when when you saw this merging of finance and industry, there was a difference in perspective, and that's why you see factories moving all around and basically making all workers have to compete with each other. That's the consequence of the free movement of capital. It makes working class people across the world poor because they have to compete with every other person, and it makes countries that are trying to develop poor because they're not able to control their own economic policy because rich people just up and move. Now, the United States has a great opportunity to do this, because the fact is, as much as they want to blow hot air, they are not. They are always going to want to invest and have money in the United States.
Right.
They might make, they might kick around and make a big deal for 6 months, 9 months, but people want their money in the United States. They want it. They want to own property here. They want to invest in the U.S. stock market. So we have incredible leverage. It's really about having the political will to do it. And I think it's important to, one, recognize that financial mobility for the rich is an aspect of class warfare, and two, that the fundamental framing is this: we want to live in a democracy, and a part of living in a democracy is making sure that private individuals don't have outsized power over the rest of us, are not able to subvert the will of the people. So that means if we want to raise taxes on rich people, they shouldn't be able to just take all their money out of the country. It's absolutely is a question of democracy, and it's one that we need to make very clear and win, because the fact is that the age of capital mobility has been devastating for the working class, and we can do it. It's been done before, and we need to reintroduce this system.
You know, I was thinking so much about what you said and growing up in South Carolina and, you know, working my way.
Oh, what is this?
It doesn't work because it's literally an off-show joke, but we're just going to start becoming Joe Biden and steal each other's life stories.
I've done some dumb things, and I'll do dumb things again.
That's also true.
It's true.
All right, we're going to take a brief break, and then we will be right back with the director of The Edge of Democracy. We'll be back shortly. Back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now in studio, it's so great to have you, is Petra Costa.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
She's the director of the Academy Award nominated, I don't want to get ahead of myself, soon to be, documentary Edge of Democracy, The Edge of Democracy, which I've been recommending people watch for a long time. And it reminds me of how annoyed I am. This is me, definitely not Petra. I am annoyed by the Academy Awards because people who for months were just like, yeah, sure, whatever, are all of a sudden like, oh, yes, that film was nominated. I will be seeing it. So it's good. We want to play the trailer, and then please just take it from there. Talk about because your story is woven in with this. And we've covered Brazil a lot on this show. I just interviewed President Lula, so people are going to have some familiarity, but we want to hear your story, and then we also want to connect it to the global currents. But let's play the ad first.
Democracy and I are almost the same age.
The music is still on, Matt. I'm going to send these guys to Bolsonaro. Ready? Okay.
Brazilian democracy and I are almost the same age. I thought that in our 30s, we would both be standing on solid ground.
Petra, for the first time voting in the historical election.
I was 19 when Lula got elected. I remember the excitement. It felt like a huge step in our democratic path. 20 million people leaving poverty. Unemployment reached the lowest number in history, and Brazil rises as a major player on the world stage.
The most popular politician on earth.
To succeed him, he chooses Dilma Rousseff, who becomes our first female president.
Todos nós seremos julgados pela história.
It felt like a change of symbols. But something in our social fabric started to change. The country divided into two parts. And this wall would rip us apart. The party is soon caught in a corruption scandal, the greatest investigation in the country's history.
O que vão pensar de nós?
Mas o arrependimento eu tenho de ter feito mais.
Crimes include fraud, slavery, even homicide.
One president impeached, another in prison. Our democracy is crumbling.
Essa farsa sexista. Estou cada dia mais vivo perante a opinião pública.
I fear our democracy was nothing but a short-lived dream.
So talk about it. Your story and the Brazilian democracy story.
So I was born believing that democracy was my birthright, achieved from a lifetime of my parents' struggle. My parents fought against the military dictatorship in Brazil and for the establishment of democracy, and I was born right after that democracy arrived. And in early 2016, I went to film these protests that were happening in the streets of Rio, asking for Dilma's impeachment. And there I saw people asking for the return of that regime that had killed and tortured hundreds and thousands of people in Brazil. And I was shocked. I saw a seed of fascism there and really wanted to understand where that was coming from and where that could lead us. And that's what the film is about.
Do you have, where do you think it's coming from?
I think it's coming from a deep class struggle, as your colleague was saying. And as Warren Buffett says, which I quote a moment in the film where he says, yes, there's class warfare, and it's our class, the rich class, that is making war and we're winning. In Brazil, precisely that started in 2014 with the election of Dilma versus Aécio Neves, which is from the center-right party. And Aécio reacted in the same way that Trump threatened to react had Hillary won. He said that, he basically didn't recognize Dilma's election and started a movement to impeach her, and then started looking for a crime that would justify that impeachment. And they found a crime that is fiscal makeup, hiding the deficit that most presidents had done before Dilma never had been considered an impeachable crime, and does not rise to the level of a high crime and a misdemeanor. And if, as most political science say, when you don't recognize the result of an election, that's kind of the foundation of a democracy. If Obama had not recognized Trump's election, the U.S. would be in a much deeper crisis than you are right now, right? And that was the crisis that we were.
And if Trump doesn't recognize if he loses.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the mess that Brazil got into, with continuous disrespect of the rule of law by some who wanted to get it back to power no matter what. And that happened first with Dilma's impeachment and then with the imprisonment of Lula, which then culminated with the election of far-right candidate Bolsonaro.
I want to talk about these three personalities because you spent time with all of them, including Bolsonaro. So we've talked a lot about Lula on this show, so maybe we'll get to him last. But before that, how did you get such access to the Workers' Party specifically?
My mother had been an activist of the party in the early days. I had gone to rallies and things like that, but I didn't know him well at all. And so as soon as the process began and he was taken in enforced coercion, they call, I asked to interview him. I sent him a letter, a very long letter, and also sent Dilma a letter. I asked to Moro, the other main characters of the film, and no one responded. They never read those letters. So I went then to the Brazilian Congress with our crew and started to get access to the congressmen. Bolsonaro gave me access immediately. And every congressperson I would meet, I would ask if they could help me get access to these other people. They said it was impossible. They all were all going through the most historical moment in any of their lives. Yeah. So months on end where we were in Brasilia having no access to any of them, I finally managed to infiltrate myself into this bus full of historians that were going to visit Dilma in the presidential palace.
Oh, wow.
And that's how I got to meet her for the first time. I handed her a DVD of my first film and asked for an interview, which she granted. And from there, we established a relationship where I would get more trust from her. And with Lula, months later, I already had a trailer of the film that we had edited, and I showed him that trailer. I managed to get a meeting with him in his office, showed him that trailer, explained that the film was kind of more verite style and I wanted to accompany him. And he said, okay, if you hang around my office until night, maybe if my wife allows, you can tag along in the car. And she did, and after 8 hours she arrived and she allowed, and I filmed with him.
And so tell us more about Dilma. I feel like that's somebody who obviously doesn't, she isn't necessarily as historical a figure as Lula, but she was the target of this impeachment. And I'll put my bias on it. What I was really struck by watching the film was that a lot of things that people say about Hillary Clinton, who I am not a fan of, would accurately apply to her. So people would say like, oh, she's really, yes, she has trouble as a politician, but she actually has an enormous amount of like personal courage, right?
Yeah.
Things I do not buy as described to Hillary Clinton, they seem to be like an exact match for Dilma. Like this is actually an extraordinary person who has a huge amount of resiliency and then got caught in this fascistic moment, I would suspect a US-backed moment, and also with a huge amount of gender dynamics and misogyny that actually got spilled over on Lula too. So could you talk more about her and just the dynamic of understanding who she was and what she was going through?
Yes. So Dilma had been a guerrilla fighter during the dictatorship. She was imprisoned for 2 years, brutally tortured, and then in the south of Brazil got into a career where she was like a secretary of mining and energy. Lula perceived her and met with her and was impressed with her competence and invited her to join his government, first as Minister of Energy and like natural resources, then as Chief of Staff. And he would call her the mother of his government, which can be kind of misogynistic a little bit, but I think he did it in a loving way.
I have to say he compared himself to a mother in my interview with him. So it's interesting how he uses that. He said being president is like being a mother. That was his analogy, which I don't think, maybe in 2020 with people trying to kind of posture as woke, but you would never hear that historically in the United States. So that's interesting.
Yeah, like matria.
Yeah.
And so they were very close during those years, and he attributes the success of his government a lot to her. But many ministers that had to deal with her complained that she was always extremely rough, that they didn't feel listened by her. And in an interview to me, Lula says, yes, they would complain to me, and I would console them. and
you get beat off on by Dilma and you go to Papa Lula to get a little pat on the shoulder.
And he says, and I thought when she would become president, it would be different. But she got even more hard on, I think. And many people complained that they did not have a good communication with her. She starts her presidency in early 2011. And for the first 2 years, she has the highest approval rates of any president in Brazil's history, if I'm not wrong. Until in 2013, these protests begin again asking for against this rise in the bus fare. And in 1 month, her popularity drops from 70 to 30%. It was the most incomprehensible event in Brazilian history. Until today, people are still trying to understand what happened, these protests of June that really shaped this far-right movement that started to take over the country, because these protests started progressive, but over time, and I believe through a lot of influence of social media, this far-right discourse started to hijack them, with people at the end asking for the return of the military, something we had never heard of in Brazilian history, since the dictatorship finished. And Dilma's popularity was then deeply hurt by that. However, she manages to get reelected the next year, even though the entire Brazilian establishment had supported the other candidate. Because I think for a few reasons, because Lula had always done, at least after he was elected, I think because it was so hard for him to get elected, he only got elected when he told the elite, no, I will not threaten any of your interests. So he did not threaten throughout his mandate, his 2 mandates, any interests of the elite. Dilma did. Not only did she lower the interest rates of the banks for a little moment, but also in the communication, she would not receive well the owner of a construction company or the owner of a huge bank. And so this malaise, this kind of uncomfortable situation started to exist between the Brazilian establishment and Dilma. And there was even a movement of people asking for Lula to come back in that election in 2014. But he decided not to. He thought it was Dilma's choice, and she chose to be reelected. However, the entire establishment went the other with ISU. ISU didn't win, so everyone went for her impeachment immediately after.
Yeah, it was something that was going to happen regardless.
Yeah.
So then we get the cause that second.
Yes.
I mean, it's funny. All of the things that Trump claims is happening to him have happened to Lula and Dilma. That's one of the funny, there was this fake investigation and illegitimate impeachment. All of this stuff actually happened in Brazil.
But here it's quite different, no?
It's very, well.
Or no? Do you see similarities?
No. In terms of, I mean, it's quite different. It's complicated. So his claiming that he's innocent and the investigations against him are illegitimate is ludicrous. Yeah. And everybody kind of universally understands him as some type of criminal, including people who like him. And I think that that's part of his popularity in certain quarters, right? I think the thing that's maybe more subtle and some people go overboard with is how do you actually beat him, and do you want it to simply be like a bureaucratic process that probably won't be particularly effective? And why is it that, a standard left-wing critique here would be why is it that the Democratic Party is so obsessed with Russia or Ukraine versus just very clear and very demonstrable corruption? Why not an impeachment built around the fact that he trades his hotel getting booked out for foreign policy as a normal practice, basically. And, I think and this may in some ways be analogous to Brazil as well, which is that if you get into that realm, Trump does what everybody does in a much more naked and transparent way. But there's quid pro quo across the entire system. But no, I mean, mostly it's ridiculous. It's just been very funny to watch because every time I see Trump say, well, it's a rigged investigation and it's totally unfair, I always am thinking of Lula and Dilma, and I'm like, you think that this is happening to you, but it is not. And it's a funny analogy. So
I think Bannon and Trump have been very competent in kind of hijacking the progressive discourse in a very
Talk about
way.
that. That's interesting. Yeah. Tell me.
No, Bannon's in American Dharma, the film by Errol Morris, he says at one moment, we have to do the revolution before they do it. There was clearly, after Occupy Wall Street, a desire to reclaim power by the people, and we're going to offer them that because otherwise they're going to do it themselves, and that they've been very efficient at creating a narrative that seems to be for the people.
Yeah, they have been, and they have the perfect opponents in most members of the Democratic Party because if Joe Biden is the nominee, then what do we do, right? Then it's going to be, yes, it's different, and sure, it's ridiculous that Trump could accuse anybody else of corruption, but he doesn't care. He'll do it regardless. And then we'll sit and we'll have a several-month argument about whose kids are more corrupt and whose deals are more unsavory and who's going to win. I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion, but that kind of argument where, yes, you can basically say, and you can also flip both sides of it because they're very effective at this too. You can either do pretend fake populism, or you can kind of say on another level, okay, sure, I'm a little corrupt, but at least I'm kind of telling you that, and there's a certain entertainment to how I'll present my corruption. I mean, if you look at I haven't followed it necessarily that closely, but the evolving reactions to this Ukraine phone call, first, I didn't. Then it's basically I made the call and it was great.
It was a perfect
best call ever done, and I'm exposing corruption. And I think, the problem here, and I'm actually curious if you could tell me if both what you think of this and if there's some similar dynamic with Bolsonaro, that he takes enough generalized disgust that people do have. Because I think people have some understanding that yes, there's calls that are made and favors are traded and oh my God, this whole thing is so disgusting and why was Joe Biden's son doing this to begin with and what the fuck, right? And so he can kind of play around that, and unless you have and I think in Brazil, because I think President Lula is an incredible, if Barack Obama did for this country what Lula did for Brazil, we would say he's the best president in the history of, like, just hands down. So they had to wage a much more relentless war against the Workers' Party than they would have to do against Democrats here. But you could see parallels with, you can take a generalized apolitical dissatisfaction with the system and corruption discourse and very easily make that fascistic, because there's no class understanding, there's no analysis. But anyways, I mean, first of all, do you agree with that? And does Bolsonaro have a similar thing that he's able to do in Brazil in terms of, like, as an example, taking the things that are emerging every day, it seems like, about him and his family?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's how the far right in Germany called communist socialists. It was by using the adjective corrupt. And it's interesting as well, even in Greece, when there was this Macedonian invasion of Greece that finished with democracy, and then they established that only those with a huge portion of land would be able to vote. The tyrant that made that invasion then said, no, I'm by this reestablishing democracy. Right. So consistently we've had in the history of humanity coups on democracy that are done under the guise of actually saving democracy. And it's curious that it's always about tax. It's about the rich not wanting to pay taxes and wanting to have the poor people super grateful that they do acts of philanthropy. So consistently we're having the same thing. With Dilma, the impeachment started, the week it started, it was quite symbolic that one of the groups that were asking for her impeachment were also protesting against a law to tax great fortunes.
Right, of course. And the Atlas Network, which is a Koch brothers network, was involved in this. And I mean, I guess also I'll just put it bluntly. I mean, do you see, certainly Lula and I think Dilma herself are quite overt now about them thinking that there's a U.S. role in this. It makes sense to me. Do you see that aspect of this story as well?
In '64, when there was the military coup in Brazil, it would take ages for it to be proven that the U.S. was backing that coup. So I think it will take a while for this proof to come if it happened. But what exists right now is indications that there were corporations that were instructing and manipulating the events, as for example the Koch brothers that you mentioned that financed MBL, this movement Brasil Livre, that was one of the far right movements that was behind the impeachment, doing Facebook advertisements and garnering support for the Dilma's impeachment right after she was elected.
What about Bolsonaro? You met with him. First of all, what was that like? And did you see him coming? And what has it been like? Has he been able to pull off a Trump kind of dynamic?
Yes, I think they're very similar in many ways. So I met with him in 2016. In Congress, the day of the voting of Dilma's impeachment, where he became worldly famous for dedicating his vote to the general responsible for her torture, and was not punished for that speech, which is really shocking. And he had already a following then. He told me in the quarters that he was wanting to run for president in 2 years. And he had 11% in vote intentions. No one believed that would ever happen. I mean, I spoke to everyone. I mean, every political scientist, every politician, journalist. And until 2 months before his election, everyone would laugh with the possibility that he would win. Because he had 30 seconds of television space, which is how usually an election is decided in Brazil. But he was very smart, like Salvini in Italy, in creating this huge social media following and tapping into this like sleeping fascism that hadn't been touched upon and massaged since the 60s, or actually before, even when the integralist movement happened in Brazil in the 40s, 30s. And he woke up this ghost that we didn't even know was there. but was clearly there because Brazil didn't know how to deal with its past in a way that really transformed the society. And he grew a lot because of Lula's imprisonment as well. That was,
right, absolutely.
As The Intercept showed, the possibility of collusion between Moro and the prosecutors, and then Moro becomes his justice minister of Bolsonaro.
Pretty obvious. Yeah.
And now the prosecutor's office in Brazil tries to incriminate Glenn Greenwald for revealing what the government should be investigating were the possible crimes of Moro, but no, instead they will kill the messenger.
Right.
And the government has been very fast in destroying all the agencies that build Brazilian civil society and are essential for Brazilian democracy, be it the agencies that control that deforestation won't happen in the Amazon, be it by incentivizing the police to kill in Rio de Janeiro, which already has the highest homicide rate of police killing people, civilians, more people are killed by the police in the state of Rio than in the entire United States.
Right.
And he's asking the police to kill more.
To actually increase that rate.
And that rate has increased by 20% since he took office. The censorship in the arts has been shocking because during the military dictatorship, they had to do another coup, which was the Institutional Act number 5, that actually to establish censorship, but now they managed to establish censorship in the guise of a democracy. There were 30 works of art that were censored last year. There's been huge cuts in financing of cinema, of the arts. No more LGBTQ plus content. There was a book that was censored in an art fair just because it had 2 men kissing. And even my film was attacked for being what the president and his secretary of culture at the time called fiction and fantasy. And then that same secretary of culture then 4 days later makes a speech plagiarizing Goebbels.
I was there for that. That was exciting. That was wild to actually be sitting at it was really funny because we were at this totally some type of thing that would be in Brooklyn, some type of lunch place where you can eat quinoa. And on the screen, they're translating it to me. They're like, "Yeah, our culture minister is quoting Goebbels." So, all right,
really?
Yeah. The people I was with. Another parallel that I think is, you talked about this idea of waking up a ghost because Brazil had not dealt with its history, and I think that's another. It's certainly a prevalent in the United States, but it seems to me to be this is very. A common symptom of right-wing politics or fascism is the psychological, emotional need for a historical fantasy, both because you can't have a material understanding of what's actually happening now, or you want to protect, vestiges of hierarchy or privilege. But these messages can get really broadly sent out because we live in societies that don't have any sense of the context that they're existing in. And you see this in the United States in every single category. There's just a basic lack of any kind of, forget even left wing, I'm talking just even basic information of the trajectory of this country.
Yeah.
And that was something that I also caught from your film, that it's, if the world started in 1989 and all you've gotten is a bunch of weird propaganda about the Workers' Party, and Brazil also has a big YouTube right-wing phenomenon, just like the United States, and you don't even have a concept of what was this thing you're imagining. And in a bizarre way, not in any way to defend him, but Bolsonaro to me seems like such a fanatic and such a fool, in my words, that it almost seems like it's almost kind of made up for him as well. Like it's something that kind of, he was in it, but he was junior. It was already basically ending. And he's got this whole imagined world he wants to be part of.
Yeah. What is tragic is that I think he's not the bad guy. I mean, he is a complex character, but he is the result of repeated attacks to the rule of law that were done with a consensus of so much of the Brazilian establishment that thought it was okay to play with democracy, thought it was okay to destroy the results of an election, to put the institutions into continuous conflict so long as Dilma would be ousted from power and Lula would be imprisoned, and then they thought that the PSDB, which is the center-right party, would win, and we would have like a clean center-right party, and everything would be fine. That party was destroyed by its own hands.
This is the Jeb Bush party.
And not only was it destroyed, but it destroyed democracy with it.
Yeah.
And I think there's a book called How Democracies Die that has been helpful for me, because it says precisely, I mean, every person I would interview in this process would say, Lula's imprisonment is constitutional, Dilma's imprisonment is constitutional, like, what's the problem? And this book says, well, the problem is that what protects a democracy is not the Constitution, it's two unwritten norms, mutual respect and self-control, which means you have through the constitutions all the instruments you need to destroy your opponent by not allowing them to appoint judges in the Supreme Court, like the Republicans did with Obama, by calling all they say fake news, by calling them a terrorist group, which is what they started doing in Brazil in 2014. Even the center-right started to call the Workers' Party a terrorist party, a party associated with dictatorships and things like that, by discrediting the legitimacy of a political party in one of the most rooted political parties in Brazil. The Workers' Party is essential for Brazilian democracy, as well as the PSDB was. And by putting them into this war, they destroyed the Brazilian political system and gave rise to this Frankenstein.
Yeah. Do you think that the more corporate-oriented interests were? I mean, this is what you can get from the Intercept leaks, right? I'm sure that a couple of years ago, maybe these people that were targeting Lula and the Workers' Party, they would prefer the center-right party emerge. But at the end of the day, if it has to be, it has to be Bolsonaro, it's Bolsonaro. I mean, look at Davos. There was a great report from Kate Ashroff in the New Republic saying, Davos still likes to present itself as very concerned about global warming and inequality and enlightened oligarchy. And Trump and Mnuchin are having a great Davos. Yeah. And last year, Bolsonaro had a great Davos because at the end of the day, I mean, capital will break fascists because it will protect capital.
Yeah. There's a great quote by Umberto Eco in his book, Fascism, where he says that in the 1930s, the European liberals decided that fascism was the best revolution to protect them of the communist threat.
Right.
And that's what's fascinating and shocking of the moment we're living in history now, which we would think, that capitalism was dysfunctional and that capitalists were driven by greed, but not that they would accept fascists ruling their countries and even try to help that happen, right?
Well, particularly when even the alternative is not even communist revolution. It's
exactly.
Like basic social democracy.
Yeah.
But I think that, well, I'm a Marxist, so it doesn't surprise me that much.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you read this all that, what Benjamin said, that it's doesn't he say in the essay to history that it's just history is made of continuous fascism that we.
Oh, yeah. And I think, so I want to actually just go back to Trump for a minute, just specifically because I have this skepticism about impeachment, not because great, impeach him, awesome. Anything, honestly, that even just wastes their time is good. But I think that if we know it's a political exercise, and if we know that it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to get acquitted, we have to start measuring it through the lens of we have to spend our time as effectively as possible politically to destroy and defeat him. But that is not a very institutional view. So I'm curious, when you look at how these institutions break down in a way that does discredit democracy, do you have like a different feeling about it? Do you think that that process of registering something against him, even just institutionally, is really important in thwarting this process, or no?
Registering something?
Well, just like, okay, he's not going to get removed from office, but we're saying we're still going to go through this motion because clearly you violated the law. Clearly something has happened. So we know politically you're safe, it's fine. And maybe this will make you less popular, maybe it won't. But institutionally, we're saying we still function enough that we're going to just register this, even though it won't make any difference. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, I'm not familiar enough with the situation in the United States, but from what I've been reading, he's accused of committing a crime that hits the heart of why the impeachment law exists, which is to prevent this type of abuse of power and interfering in a national election with the help of a foreign country and bribing that foreign country to do so.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I wouldn't even say help. He's threatening them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He's just saying,
Yeah, threatening a foreign country to interfere in a
Yeah.
national election. So I think it's essential to give the message that that is an infringement and an attack in the rule of law, because otherwise, where do you put the limit, right? And I think a healthy democracy is about constantly having reminders of where those limits are, because otherwise these abuses, and I mean, it's already happened, right? With the way he uses Twitter, the way he deploys of the term fake news, the way he attacks the press. How will it be with the next president, be he Democrat or Republican? How much will have Trump push the limits of what's acceptable, right? And made people forget what is unacceptable.
Do you think, though, and this is another question that's tricky, because part of why we've gotten where we are, certainly in the United States, is these institutions have become so radically self-discrediting. We have, and I think this is shared with Brazil and elsewhere, we have the class warfare from the top, like Warren Buffett said, but we also have, I mean, just even the New York Times sitting down with Bernie Sanders and saying, well, you have crowds, so aren't you like Trump? This type of thing that, regardless even of what you think of Bernie Sanders, that is such an absurd and offensive analogy to say that, somebody who stirs up racism and xenophobia in crowds and somebody who stirs up crowds to fight for people having health care are doing the same thing. And so what I wonder, and I want your thoughts on, is that yes, people like Trump and Bolsonaro, of course they're pushing the bounds. And of course, I mean, they're anti-democratic forces. That's quite clear. But the institutions that they're getting so much mileage out of discrediting, no one has done more to discredit those institutions than the institutions themselves. So we're at like this, do we devolve out of democracy moment, or do we actually evolve something that is democratic but is, restored and healthy? I don't know that we can retrieve these things that have discredited themselves. So even a next president, even if they're not Trump, they're still going to be operating in a very different landscape, even if they're not a demagogue, where people don't trust the media, people don't trust the judiciary, and rightfully so, right?
Yeah, it's such a challenge.
Yeah.
Everything has become deeply dysfunctional. And I think, I don't know, I have the impression that 2008 could have been a shifting point where the dysfunctionality that capitalism had intensified from the 70s, 80s with Thatcher, as he was saying, Reagan, and could have been corrected, even and not in a radical way necessarily. I mean, just if one is faithful to what Adam Smith would recommend. Adam Smith himself said if corporations were not regulated, were not controlled by the state, a little bit, fascism would come out. I mean, and Franklin Roosevelt as well said that if the United States did not continuously reinvent its democracy for it to serve the people, it would become a fascist state. So these reforms need to happen. It's gone way too far. We're like 30, 40 years in delay of a very needed reform for democracy to be functional again.
You said in a recent piece for The Guardian that Lula, regardless of what you think of his case, and obviously we think he's innocent, he's a political prisoner and so on, but that he is a stand-in for this assault, if I understood you correct, like that his imprisonment is important for everybody concerned about these themes and his persecution.
Everyone concerned with democracy.
Anybody internationally concerned with democracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, Lula
Talk about that,
is
please.
one of the most important political figures in the world. Bannon himself said that after Obama left politics, that Lula was the most important leader of the globalist movement and the biggest threat to his far-right project. So there are very big international interests on his imprisonment, on silencing Lula. And anyone interested in the rule of law should have 4 years ago said something about how the Brazilian judiciary was continuously abusing of their own power to put Lula in prison. Okay, they didn't say it. Now they could still say it because I have no doubt that everything will be done to imprison Lula again.
And we need to fight very strongly against that, everybody.
Yes, there needs to be more international generosity and empathy about what has been happening in Brazil.
How do you, just on a slightly more personal level in the last couple of minutes, what's the juxtaposition like of doing a documentary that's really good, and you'll talk in a few minutes about all the ways people can watch it and support it and spread the word, but you're documenting something that's such a tragedy for your country and obviously affects you a lot, and like amazing, great personal accomplishment. That's an interesting paradox, right? You're like, well, it's a big deal. You're nominated for an Academy Award. Like that's significant. Like what? Like the paradox of such an upsetting topic, incredible work, and like deserved recognition.
It was sad, but like throughout this process, I would continuously get vertigo, depression, nausea. But I would think, okay, the worse it gets, the better the film.
Oh, God.
So that was like the only thought that would give me a little bit of strength. But it was like this bittersweet strength that of course, I didn't want for anything of this to happen. And I try sometimes to look at it as a fiction film.
Yeah.
And that's how I managed to get a little bit of, and whenever another event happens, it hits me back. And it's like, oh my God, no, it's real. Yeah. But it seems like it was scripted by this like hallucinogenous, like far right terror, like horror movie.
That's
fanatic.
exactly how it feels. And I mean, honestly, down to there are people on the street in this film, and it's so tricky, particularly with like the show we do, where of course there's global patterns, and of course there's parallels you can draw, and then you have to balance that with the fact that of course every place is very different. But some of the people at these Bolsonaro rallies, I have never anywhere, including the United Kingdom, which is usually everybody thinks is the closest to the United States. I don't necessarily think that. I have never seen right-wing on-the-street talk that sounds as exact as you would hear in the United States about Trump.
Oh, it is amazing.
It's extraordinary.
But I think you guys had, it feels like there were people there going there and giving workshops.
Absolutely.
I mean, it really feels like that.
We saw the NRA sticker in Bolsonaro's office, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there an NRA
so.
sticker? I believe there was, or maybe even like literally stand your ground sticker.
And I would interview these congressmen, and they would give me words in English every now and again. And it's like, we don't need to get the power now. We'll do it. And he would say this part in Portuguese, and they'd say this part in English. We'll do it step by step. It all felt like they'd gone through like an MBA.
MBA in fascism.
Yeah. Or at least in like far right thought, yeah.
Destabilization. what are all of the ways? I mean, people can still watch this on Netflix, right?
Yeah.
So I'll say, I know on Saturday, February 8th, I'm going to be at a panel at, I'll have the information next week, but I know that Brazilians for Democracy is doing this panel, and we're going to show your film. That's going to be in Midtown Manhattan. I'll have more details next week.
Great.
So that's one event, but there's tons of different ways that people can interact with this film. So do you want to tell?
Yes. I mean, we have our website, theedgeofdemocracy.com. We have, through social media, it's through my page, Petra Costa, on Instagram, or Petra Costa on Facebook. And you can also do educational screenings by contacting us at Impacto, with a O at the end, at buscavidafilms.com. It's all on our website.
Okay, and we'll tweet all of this information out. Petra, I really appreciate you coming and visiting us.
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Please watch this film. Guys, we're going to go to the post game. Thanks to each and every one of you. We'll be back live in a little bit. Join us at patreon.com/TMBS, tmbs.fm. We can get all of the information, including our upcoming live shows in Brooklyn and Austin. And you can get hoodies, books, all sorts of stuff. Come on, man. And we will see you next week. Monday, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C., co-anchoring Iowa Caucus coverage for The Hill with Crystal and Sagar. Wednesday, we will be here. I think we've got some really great guests lined up, but we will be digesting. We will either be basically like playing like Biggie and Queen and gloating because Bernie won, or we're going to be picking Matt off of the floor. He's in a heap of depression. All right, everybody, we'll see you soon. Thank you.